Geothermal, we see, or I saw, as an anomaly and an opportunity, both. It's an anomaly because geothermal is the world's largest energy resource by far. And that includes the combination of oil and gas, coal, and everything. But it is a tiny percentage of the world's actual energy supply. That's the anomaly. But the opportunity is that because only 2% of the world's geothermal resource is accessible with conventional geothermal technology, Greenfire and some other companies are going after the 98% with, in our case, what was called advanced geothermal systems technology, also known as closed loop technology. Closed loop geothermal has many advantages. So for example, we have a project going here in Northern California where we're bringing only heat to the surface, not water mass. And as you may know, water in geothermal resources is very important, both for energy transmission, but also to preserve the resource going forward. So the ability with a closed loop system to reach down, grab the heat with a working fluid, bring it to the surface without destroying or affecting the resource pressure or taking any water mass out of the resource is a huge advantage, both for long-term sustainability and for power production. From an environmental point of view, closed loop has many advantages as well because we're circulating a working fluid in the closed loop. We're not interfering with whatever else is in the resource or bringing whatever else is in the resource to the surface. Chemicals you don't want to share on the surface are going to the atmosphere, for example. So there are lots of advantages, both environmentally and practically, with closed loop.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to all in attendance. And welcome again to Pivot 2022. I am Jason Fisher, and I am happy to be here again with you moderating this panel. So over the last few years, interest and investment in the geothermal space has grown exponentially in the hope of getting geothermal everywhere, which includes the closed-loop geothermal, better known as advanced geothermal systems, and deep super hot rock geothermal systems. This has left many people to wonder about the status of hydrothermal resources. Our topic for today is revisiting hydrothermal niche or low-hanging fruit. Here with us today to explore the topic are our esteemed panelists, Dr. Javier Perez. Could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Jason. Hello, everyone. Javier Perez, geoscientist. I currently work for Ecopetrol at the Innovation and Technology Center. I'm currently in charge of research and developing a pioneer project for a high temperature geothermal project in Colombia and the company. Good to meet you all, very excited as well.
Thank you, Javier. Taoufik.
Yes, Maureen, thanks a lot for the opportunity to attend this meeting. I'm Taoufik Ettajer. I'm the manager of technology project at Repsol Tech Lab, mainly for Subsurface. And when we say technology project, it's all the technology that are needed for not only for oil and gas, but also for energy transition, geothermal included, but also our energy, other energy, clean energies and green energies, and also the way to pivot existing technologies to take advantage of those ones and develop those new kind of energies. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Peter So.
Hi, Peter So with Calpine. Been with Calpine about 22 years now. I'm the director of project management and development, and yeah, looking forward to speaking on the panel.
Thank you. And last but not least, Patrick Walsh.
Hi, good morning, and thanks again for having me. I am the Chief Operating Officer for Cyrq Energy and responsible for both the operating facilities and the subsurface work at 6 geothermal fields, 6 conventional geothermal fields.
Okay. So thank you everybody for introduction. So let's get straight to it as we have a lot to talk about and to discuss. So based on current interest and investment climate in the geothermal space, are hydrothermal resources niche or low-hanging fruit? What are your thoughts? Let's start with the panelists who have the most experience so far in the geothermal space, Peter or Patrick, whoever to go first.
Peter, I'm
I guess we're just all waiting for each other to go.
Yeah, okay, Patrick, go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think I sort of chuckled when I saw the title for this, because right now, nearly 100% of existing electricity generation is from conventional geothermal. And so with that, you know, there are about 3.6 gigawatts installed in the US, something like 25% of the world's capacity. We've put more than 400 megawatts online in the last 10 years. And there's a huge effort continuing to develop new conventional geothermal. As a company and personally, Cyrq supports what I would call all-in geothermal, meaning we have a conventional field. We can use it as a test base for new technologies, for EGS, for AGS, and we're using our site for these and supportive. But at the end of the day, right now, all of the electricity generation is from conventional geothermal, and there's still a huge potential around the world.
Peter, anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I'll add to that for sure. Yeah, like Patrick said, I think it's pretty clear that hydrothermal is low-hanging fruit because that's what's available at the moment. I just want to provide a couple of things about Calpine and the knowledge base that we have. I mean, the first exploratory well was drilled in 1920, and the first modern well was drilled in 1955. And then the first commercial power plant actually for us went live in 1960. And at the geysers, we have 45 square miles of geothermal operation, 322 steam wells, 54 injection wells. Our deepest well is 12,900 feet. And we have 13 operating plants, 90 miles of steam pipe, 69 miles of water injection pipe, and 70 miles of 21 kV power lines. So there's been a lot of experience, obviously, in the space. I think we're still continuing to learn and improve. And, you know, with the investments that we've seen in the last few years, we're able to take advantage of any kind of advancement in the space. And I think there's a lot of definitely low-hanging fruit that we could take advantage of what's going on right now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter and Patrick. What are the ideas coming from the oil and gas industry from Javier?
Thank you, Jason. For Ecopetrol and for Colombia, we are starting to develop this huge geothermal potential, right? And I agree with Peter and Patrick. Low-hanging fruit is what hydrothermal is all about, especially from the oil and gas wells that are going to be converted into, geothermal. But as I mentioned, I'm currently doing research on high temperature, the big fish. And we are exploring technologies and the reservoirs and the potential that we have in the fire belt in our country. And evaluating those technologies to see where it takes us and if it's another level of magnitude that we could explore with the geothermal capacity in the country.
Thank you. Taoufik?
Yes. In fact, yes, low-hanging fruit. I mean, I agree with the other panelists. And on the other hand, what we think is when it comes to technology, because this is, by the way, the key element that from Repsol we're investing a lot on and also exploring is how we can pivot the existing technology from oil and gas and take advantage to speed up the development of geothermal. Of course, geothermal historically, it's producing already some a good amount of energy with the levelized cost of energy for the hydrothermalism, for example, around 50 euros megawatt hour. And we think from that this will stay. But on the other hand, the cost of the drilling, the cost of completion, and the difference between this kind of drilling for the geothermal, especially when you reach the 170 or 200 degrees centigrade, there are different challenges. But from Repsol point of view, and since we have assets in different areas, going from conventional, unconventional, and also geothermal, and also offshore, deep and shallow offshore. So we see really a lot of opportunities in developing those kind of sources, taking advantage of the existing technologies and also the competencies, which for us is also a really important point.
Okay, great. Thank you. So following up on what you just said, what technologies do you think will allow us to speed up the development and utilization of hydrothermal resources?
Yeah,
Patrick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think Taoufik touched on it for sure. The drilling advances that we've seen, so being able to get to 10,000 feet much faster, it reduces the risk. So if you're doing exploration, it reduces the cost, and can also put projects online faster. I think, as everyone is aware, there's still significant challenges where I think we can learn even on the permitting side from oil and gas. Geothermal has often been very slow to get to permitting, and it's something that we can learn. It's not exactly a technology, but it's something that the industry has been weak on.
Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with Patrick. I think the drilling is going to be the big advantage. I think that oil and gas could bring to the table. They definitely drill a lot more wells than the geothermal space has, and I think there's a lot of things that we could learn from it.
So there has been a lot of focus on the development of hydrothermal resources for electricity. Would you say that the utilization of these resources for heat is also low-hanging fruit?
Yes.
Anybody?
I believe so. I mean, I think the heat, the kind of heat that comes from the hydrothermal space, I think matches the heat requirements. So yeah, I think that's also very useful.
Yeah, I think Iceland provides a shining example of this, where you have developed resources and they're using everything. They're using for electricity, and then they're taking that heat and making either pools or district heating. And again, I mentioned that the 3.6 gigawatts in the US, almost none of that is used directly for heat. There are a few greenhouses, there are a few small places where district heating is used, but there's also less incentive, and it's a challenge for companies to take that heat and supply it to someone else. So finding a way, and again, maybe this is something oil and gas can help with from a project management standpoint, and getting different investors involved. But there's almost no utilization. So it's a very low hanging fruit, because the resources are already there, they're already developed, and we're not using the heat.
Yeah, that is true. I think the perfect example of heat utilization from hydrothermal resources in the Netherlands, right, where they've developed this massive district heating system using old oil and gas wells. And we need to not forget that we can also use it for cooling, especially since many places in the United States and everywhere else are experiencing extreme temperatures, right? So let's answer a couple of questions from the audience. So the first one is, what is the size of the traditional hydrothermal opportunity globally? How much is undeveloped in gigawatts or terawatts, etc.? It's open to anybody who's willing to take it.
That's a really tough question. I mean, I don't think we know what we know, what we don't know yet, right? I think there's data out there that I think people can take a look at and see what the opportunity are. I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a very tough question. I think there's quite a bit. There's a lot of heat underground, and I think if we find the right locations, we could explore that. But I don't have an answer really.
Yeah, I would say I have not done a global study, but I would say onshore easily tens of gigawatts, and if you include offshore, it's in the hundreds of gigawatts.
And if I may also add, it also depends on the type of usage, and it was already addressed. When we talk about district heating, it's big, because you don't need a big differential temperature to heat some of the areas. For greenhouse, the same thing. So if we really take into account a small usage for greenhouse, for district heating, for a small plant, for example, this is, I mean, the potential is huge, is really gigantic. Now, if we're trying to see see what kind of potential exists to address a big installation, like, for example, a big industrial plant, or to have for the full city. Yes, probably it's a little bit different, but I will say that depends on what scale we are looking for, and depending also if we want to do heating and cooling, or just electricity. But overall, yes, the amount is huge.
Okay, so a question for Javier and Taoufik. Are oil and gas entities engaging in geothermal projects are you getting good feedback, support, and what is the reaction of the public?
That's good.
I can jump in, and thanks for that question. It's very interesting. Actually, Ecopetrol has jumped into the transition, into renewables, and the compromise is to 2040, up to 30 to 50% of its revenues are expected to be coming from renewable energy. Besides that, the new policies are very favorable for geothermal projects, in terms of tax reductions and incentives to develop this type of projects. And technically, we see a very huge potential on the subsurface. So the short answer is yes. We're very looking forward to developing geothermal. I'm actually in charge of looking at high temperature, deep and very hot stuff. And we're very excited to hopefully in the near future have could show some results of that.
Yeah, from Repsol side, I will just give a few examples just to show you how we're really involved and interested. I mean, again, you know that in 2019 we made the commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050, so there are a lot of steps, different steps, and a lot of types of energy, but geothermal definitely is one key. So one of the examples is in conventional assets in the US, and we're exploring some of the assets that are currently producing hydrocarbon and see in terms, instead of just plug and abandon some of the wells, why not reusing them and use the energy that we are getting there to at least offset some of the electricity we are using for the whole installation. So it's really a win-win because we are removing the load on the grid, and we're also reusing some of the wells and getting the last drop of not the hydrocarbon of the oil, but the last drop of the joule from those assets. We have also other example. I mean, you know about the Canary Island, where we have also access to different type of energies, and we're also working on this. I would like to just mention that one point really for us, really important beside the technology, is to have the commitment of the local communities, because without the involvement of the local communities, it's going to be really hard. So we're also working hand in hand with the local communities, with the schools, educate the kids, just to tell them how really what's the oil and gas industry is doing as a good for the whole community.
Okay, thank you. I have a very interesting question. I think this one is open to everybody. If hydrothermal is a low-hanging fruit, why are wind and solar the biggest players right now? Geothermal makes 0.4% of 20% renewable energy production in the US. How can we prove it as a low-hanging fruit to investors?
This is a good question. I think part of it is the risk associated with developing new resources. Some of it is the distance to transmission. So there are some very good resources that have not been developed because they're challenging in terms of their distance. So if you want to put 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts online, but you are 100 miles from a good transmission line, it makes it nearly impossible, at least with current market conditions. So some of it's risk, some of it's distance to transmission. And going back to the question about what oil and gas can do, if we can look at energy conversion, so looking at hydrogen or something to that effect, where we can take electricity more locally and transfer it to another source so we don't have to have big transmission lines, I think there's a lot of work to do there.
Anything else to add, Peter?
No, I think I echo Patrick's issues that he brought up as far as trying to develop even more geothermal than it has been, and I think there's also a lot more advocacy, I think, in solar and wind, and they're able to get some of the incentives that may or may not be available to geothermal as well. So there's few challenges with the geothermal space and the generation and power and things like that. So
okay, great, thank you. So in terms of exploration, what does your organization need for the exploration of hydrothermal resources? Are you doing this using internal resources, and how are you funding it? Javier, let's take a look from the oil and gas perspective. How are you guys exploring hydrothermal resources, and how are you funding it?
Well, we're applying our knowledge of traditional oil and gas industry. We've done a lot on reservoir characterization on those provinces, and we're starting from there. We're starting on low mid temperatures, utilizing these oil and gas wells. But basically, our knowledge from the subsurface, from the reservoirs, you don't have the same complexity as a petroleum system for hydrothermal. But you do need some specific properties, some permeability, some cap rock, and so connection, for cycling. So we do know, we do apply this knowledge from the subsurface, and we are acquiring even new information, and we are evaluating new technologies. We're starting to do, or we want to start a campaign to acquire geophysics information for characterization and try to characterize, the dimensions and lateral extensions of these reservoirs. So we are currently investing also on that, and also research. We are doing a huge project to assess the potential, not only for hydrothermal, but for maybe more deep and complex scenarios, probably in crystalline rocks as well.
Okay, great. Now let's get some thoughts from the conventional geothermal side. Hard rock, Patrick.
Yeah, so in terms of exploration, we do a lot of the work in-house. So we have geoscientists that are out looking for new fields and working on evaluating them. We are focused on, for us, the lowest hanging fruit, which means adjacent or near to existing projects so that they're easy to tie in. But then we also have some work in what I touched on, which is distant from existing transmission and much more challenging. And so for more specialized technologies, especially big geophysical surveys, we use external resources for seismic and for MT because we are a small company and don't have the resources to have those in-house. In terms of funding, again, we have 6 existing power plants, so we have income from those, and we use to reinvest to find new resources. And again, the lowest hanging fruit is if we can expand an existing project and make more power from a reservoir that's already existing.
Okay. Anything to add, Peter, from Calpine, since your size of the company is vastly different from that of Cyrq?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the 45 square miles of geothermal operations. Yeah. I mean, we're continuing to look even within that square mileage, and we have a team of geoscientists as well. The other kind of exploration that I would consider is looking at these new advancements in technology, the closed loop and other technologies. I think similar to what Patrick has said, we have this field, we have the manpower, we have the infrastructure in place. So I think it's easy for us to try some of these new technologies that are out there. So I would consider that exploratory as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So following up on that, we have another great question. Can you comment on closed loop geothermal as a complement to hydrothermal with potential to de-risk conventional geothermal? Peter?
I think it definitely could complement our existing operations because it I think uses the resources slightly different than the traditional conventional geothermal. I think, obviously with any kind of new technology, we need to look at the risk, right? Because, our resource is our resource. We definitely don't want to impact our resource negatively. So there's a lot of modeling that needs to be done to make sure there's no interaction between the closed loop and the traditional and vice versa. So I think there's definitely, we're definitely looking at that to see if it will work out.
Anything from Cyrq, Patrick, in terms of?
I think it's an interesting question. We are working on a partnership with a closed loop in one of our plants and another partnership with EGS. And so I hadn't really thought of it as risk mitigation. It's an interesting way to think about it. If you were to go and look and say, we're going to drill in a place that we think there could be conventional geothermal with a plan to do a closed loop. I don't think anyone's taken that approach. So it's an interesting idea. I think the challenge is, again, right now, the economics for a conventional system, in my mind, are better if you can reduce the risk sufficiently. So we've been thinking of it, or I've been thinking of it more, like I said earlier, we have an existing power plant or a new power plant that we're building. Below that, perhaps we run out of permeability, or adjacent to it, we run out of permeability because we're away from the fractures that provide the very high permeability we need to generate electricity. And so I tend to think of closed loop as adjacent or underneath those systems, but I hadn't thought of it, as the industry moves forward, and closed loop, if it can become a proven technology with generation, it's an interesting idea to use it for drilling risk mitigation. You learn about the rocks and about where the fractures might be by drilling the closed loop.
Thank you. Any input from Javier or Taoufik on that topic?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Currently, we're focusing on one area where we find above 200 degrees C at just about 1 kilometer depth. And we are comparing different technologies, the traditional EGS or closed loop. And we were thinking on precisely that, drilling, checking if there is a permeability, if there could be a traditional, conventional hydrothermal system, but with the alternative of ending up with a closed loop. And we're also evaluating with a couple of companies that system and trying to simulate and see what's the scenario and what's the power generation capability. So I think it could be a good complement as well.
Yeah. And just to add on top of this one, again, same thing from Repsol, we're trying different technologies and for different areas. For the closed loop, yes, I mean, this can be one aspect where, since we're not touching the rock, we're not fracking, we're just circulating the fluid through this insulated pipe, so it will gain some energy. This could be a good point. Yes, on the other hand, yes, from technology point of view, there is still some work to be done. And but also we need to emphasize is there are a lot of small companies, and Repsol is working closely with a lot of major service companies, but also some startups that are providing very interesting technologies. I mean, it could be even sensors, some proprietary sensors, and those also can help boosting the return of investment for the closed loop, but also for other aspects of geothermal.
Okay, thank you. Since we're on the topic of risk, how can risk be mitigated for geothermal? Is it a risk of drilling wells? What is the success rate of geothermal wells drilled?
Yeah,
this is a good question. I don't know statistics globally, but the risk is much lower, again, adjacent to an existing field or within a field where it's been well characterized. We do a lot of very detailed geoscience and geophysical work to make sure that we are successful when we drill, call it large diameter production and injection wells. So even in existing fields, we would collect downhole image logs, other types of wireline logs that we can use to improve our model. And every time we drill, we're gaining more information. So we tend to take very careful steps. We do low cost exploration, mapping on the ground. We do geophysics to spend a bit more money. We prioritize the highest probability projects. So the mentality is a little bit different than what oil and gas tends to think of, going for the biggest field because it'll pay for all the other fields. In my experience in geothermal, we are looking for the most probable field. So a high probability 20 megawatts field is potentially more valuable than 100 megawatts of more risky project. So we have a little bit different exploration mentality, and we're slowly building throughout our exploration program to improve our knowledge, improve our model, and then take the last step and drill a full-size production well.
Now, I'll add to that real quick. I mean, even with the experience that we have, it's definitely not 100%. I think there's still quite a bit of misses, and what we tend to do is we still try to utilize the well for other purposes, right? Injection, and maybe we sidetrack or whatever. So I think for us, being that we've been in this space for so long and we know our reservoir pretty well, we've improved over time, but definitely not 100% even now.
Any input from the oil and gas side, Taoufik?
Yeah, I will say because I mean for this aspect, I mean since the uncertainty we just need to take it into account. But there is also the screening, and from Repsol side is when it comes to developing geothermal, we do very thorough screening associated with analytical analysis, so using analytical tools. And the goal is to gather all the public data. And surprisingly, the data that are available, that are free, it's huge. So we started with the screening, and we try also to improve the type of technology we're using during the screening of the data. And we combine also the analytical with the numerical. And this is really also another aspect which is really important is generally when you drill for oil and gas, you try to avoid, for example, faults. Here for geothermal, sometimes we're trying to target this fault, which means that it will add some additional risk. So we need also to improve the technologies for the analytical analysis, but also for the simulation, the numerical one. And again, something really important is mitigation plans, because uncertainty is there. So we need to be really good in terms of how fast can we mitigate an issue if this happens.
Yeah, and to complement on that, well, the better we know reservoirs from the traditional industry, less risky, right? But the biggest risk is on that reservoir characterization and drilling. But I believe that new technologies could develop and could help de-risk one or two factors that are critical for a geothermal system to function. For instance, permeability. For example, if these closed loops work and function, you can scale those technologies to different areas and with less risk. No, so we are looking forward to developing new technologies and complement maybe each other, like the previous question, and see if we can de-risk some new areas as well.
Following up on that technology trend, what do you think is the biggest technology breakthrough that is needed to grow hydrothermal?
High temperature instrumentation. That's probably one area, because the temperature limits on the current data collection system is not high enough.
I agree. I think measure well drilling and other technologies for higher temperature is very important. I also think the ripening of the other technologies that we talked about, EGS and AGS, if you drill a well that doesn't have sufficient permeability, being able to turn that into something that is positive, I think is very important, especially in the existing fields.
Okay. That's great. And you just answered another question that was asked. If you drill a well that ends up being unproductive, can you install a closed loop in that context? What about using it for direct use instead?
I think this does touch on risk mitigation, right? If you design a well so that it can be used for other things. So again, taking a big step back, if I drill a well and it has multiple drilling targets, this is one risk mitigation. If the well is designed such that if that doesn't work, the casing is deep and we can increase pressure to stimulate the well, this is another risk mitigation. And then maybe lastly, if those two things don't work, we can potentially use the well for a closed loop. So designing wells so that they have the best chance of success is a critical risk mitigation tool.
Peter, any thoughts?
No, I think I agree with Patrick. I think it all depends on what we're doing, and it could be the other way, right? You could be drilling for a closed loop, and you find a fracture that you weren't expecting, then you can switch that over to traditional as well. Right? So it goes both ways.
Okay, so here's a question for everybody. I want everybody to take a little bit of time to answer it. What is your single biggest obstacle to major growth in hydrothermal resources? Is it technical or is it a funding issue? Let's start with Javier.
In our case, I think the obstacle, or I would not call it obstacle, I would call it challenge, will be to develop this first pioneer pilot for Colombia and prove that the concept works. I think we have very high potential at the subsurface. Now we have the very good incentives from the government to develop this kind of project. So I will call it a challenge rather than an obstacle. We're getting there.
Okay. Taoufik?
Yeah, I mean, on top of this one, I mean, I would also add the competencies, and this is, I mean, at Repsol, and especially the technology lab, we're paying a very close attention to having the right competencies and the skills to be able to develop the geothermal, and this is really very important. So we need to pivot the skills to be able to address those ones. Some of the challenges of the geothermal are the same than oil and gas, but they're also different topics. So the skills of the people, and this is really very important for us. I mean, we need to also to make sure technology without the people, it's not really enough. On the technology point of view, yes, I mean, there is, we have some fundings, from Europe, from US and the rest of the world to develop new technologies. And the thing is, we need this kind of the wow example that will really trigger and will attract a lot of attention from the investment communities, from the investors, and also from the public, from the government or the local authorities.
Okay, Peter?
Yeah, I think I'll take a different spin to it. I think it's actually education. I think, you know, geothermal really hasn't been marketed as well as some of the other renewables. And I think the knowledge and understanding of geothermal, I mean, from a permitting, you know, Patrick mentioned permitting earlier, from a permitting standpoint, you know, I think good education of what geothermal and the risks and you know, the potentials of geothermal could help every aspect of the industry.
Patrick?
Yeah, I agree. I think that value proposition of why a geothermal field at nameplate 50 megawatts is worth more than a solar field that's nameplate 100 megawatts because of the availability and the capacity factor. But also going back to what Taoufik said, I think we need passionate people. We need passionate people coming to the industry who are excited to put new projects online, take the risk, and look for new targets, new concepts. So, you know, I know there's a session later in this conference about utilizing old oil and gas wells, or maybe looking in existing oil and gas fields where there's a lot of data already. I mentioned earlier the idea of going offshore. This requires a big company and big money to take that kind of risk. And so some of it's investment, you know, if you want to push new, perhaps more risky technologies or new fields. But really what we need is passionate people. And so I think if you look, many of the geothermal companies are almost constantly hiring. And so there are really great opportunities for some of the skill set from oil and gas, but I forget who said it, but also understanding that there's some differences needed. You know, maybe it's more chemistry, maybe it's a different kind of geophysics. But I would say almost all of the above. There are challenges to developing new geothermal, and really what we need is passionate people to make it happen.
Okay, great, thank you. So what is in your wish list to make geothermal grow in terms of regulations, policies, and permitting?
Fast permitting. if you submit, yeah, I mean, if you submit a permit right now in some, I'll say counties or regions, it can take many months or years to get from the point that you have a well design until you can actually drill it. That permitting timeline has to come down. Like I said, investment in new technologies, I think, is there in the case of EGS and AGS. But when you look at the spending, maybe from the government standpoint, I think it's about a third as much spent on conventional geothermal, reducing risk. And then also the last thing I mentioned earlier is transmission, being able to find power lines from some of the more challenging prospects that companies have.
Not much to add to that. I mean, I think Patrick covered it pretty well.
Yeah, and for Javier or Taoufik, what are your wish list for regulations and policies and permitting from Colombia and from where Repsol's focusing their research on?
Yeah, I think our wish list is getting you know, checks. Government currently is saying that 50% on the investments on a geothermal project can be deducted from taxes from the company, for example. So that's a very high incentive that could push these projects forward. And I agree fully with Patrick that we need passionate people, and we need events like this one to move this inspiration and move these technologies forward to make it happen. So
good. Taoufik?
Yeah. From Repsol side, yes, same thing. I mean, the things are evolving the right way. And when we look at permitting in Spain, but also in Europe and other countries, when you go beyond this 200 meter, you need to have the environmental impact studies. You need to have a lot of documentation to be done. And this is still, I would say it's still challenging. It's moving the right way. But we see a lot of local authorities, governments moving the right way, because, and on the other hand is, and you heard about the last, when there was a drilling between Spain and between France and Germany, and there was a kind of that triggered a kind of earthquake, which, even if it's not related definitely to the geothermal, the impression was there was a drilling for geothermal, there is an earthquake, so it must be restoration. So it needs also a lot of education to the population, to tell them that this is really a kind of energy that is really safe, and with having the population, the population.
Okay, guys, thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you for everybody that participated in the panel, and thank you for all of your questions. Thank you again for attending this panel. I am Jason Fisher, and it was a pleasure talking to everybody here today and answering all the questions from the audience. I hope we can continue this conversation at another point and help to push hydrothermal resources to continue its further development in light of all the other investment happening in geothermal resources. All right, thank you again, everybody. If the panelists have any last words for 30 seconds of one last thing you could say about hydrothermal resources, just one sentence each before we leave. Javier?
Thank you for the event. Thank you for having us, and looking forward to see geothermal developing worldwide.
Taoufik?
Thanks for the invitation. And again, geothermal is the most reliable energy that is 24/7.
Peter?
Yeah, again, thanks for having this event. Appreciate the time to be able to share Calpine's thoughts, and yeah, looking forward to even more geothermal power.
And Patrick?
Yeah, thank you, Jason and fellow panelists, and to those watching, really make the effort and come work with us. There's some really exciting things happening.
Okay. Thank you again, everybody, and make sure you enjoy Pivot 2022 and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.